Hello and welcome to part 4, your last part of session 14 for History of Healing. So in this part we're going to go through and meet some of the luminaries of the Renaissance period in European medical history. And so we'll start off with Paracelsus. Paracelsus was living from 1493 to 1541, was born with the name Aurelius Philippus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. And if you were born with a name like that, you might come up with another moniker just like he did. And he went by the name Paracelsus for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. And he was born in what is now Switzerland, but was not Switzerland at that time. So his father was a physician and a chemist, and his early teachers were high clerics with a very deep interest in alchemy, theology, and new technologies of the time. And he was educated in a humanist framework which stressed the unity and compatibility of truth across all philosophical and theological systems. So he did not hold university training in very high regard, though he did study at university and he had a doctorate degree. And he held direct experience really to be more important than books and the dogma of the day, which was Galenic medicine. And so he was one of the first to really reject the philosophies and theories of Galen. I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. At the age of 16, he already had a strong working knowledge of literature on alchemy of the time, and that was most likely from his father and from local monks. And he was a free thinker who certainly appears to have had quite an extraordinary intellect, which is true of a lot of the luminaries that we will study in this course, obviously. Here's a quote from page 28 of our De Stefano text with regard to Paracelsus, or from Paracelsus. Not all things the physician must know are taught in the academies. Now and then he must turn to old women, to Tartars who are called gypsies, to itinerant magicians, to elderly country folk, and many others who are frequently held in contempt. From them he will gather his knowledge, since these people have more understandings of such things than all the high colleges. So you can imagine how the academics felt about him when he were to say such things about academia. And so he was a bit of an outcast in the academic community. He had a love of Hippocrates, and he was really fascinated by the ideas of the Roman physician Celsus. And so he took the name Paracelsus to indicate that he was aligned with Celsus, who was really a noted critic of rationalism. And he took himself out of the Roman dogma that medicine was adhering to at the time by taking on this name Paracelsus. He received his alchemical teachings from Benedictine monks and worked to reconcile that with the understanding of how plant medicines worked. So this was very early pharmacognosy, and he was looking at things according to Dioscorides and Celsus, who had classified herbs according to the action that they had on the human body rather than according to their effects on the humors. And Paracelsus was really drawn to that classification of herbal medicines by their action, which is how we classify them today. As an interesting aside, his gender has actually been questioned by some because he was quite an effeminate man, and he had quite a female shape and no beard, did not grow any hair on his face, and he also had a vocal hatred of women. He had a vocal hatred of lots of things, so women weren't the only thing. So some have actually questioned whether he was actually a man or not, which I find fascinating. So he was the first to conceptualize and talk of specific actual active chemical constituents in plants, and he called them arcana, and though they were completely hidden to him. This was not something, the chemical constituents of anything could not be visualized by anyone at the time, or even really conceptualized, because this is before the periodic table of the elements, before molecular structures had been discovered, etc. He also wrote quite extensively of spiritual forces operating in the natural world, which he called the light of nature. So he had this equating of spirituality and nature, which harkens back to some of the pagan or nature-based spiritualities that we've studied earlier in the semester. He was very interested in toxicology of plants and other substances, and a famous dictum that's attributed to him is the dose makes the poison. So he believed that even things that were poison in higher doses were medicinal in lower doses, and that just because something was a poison didn't mean that it was useless in some form or another. One of his beliefs was that all diseases are rooted in one of what he called the entia. There are 5 of these. The ens astral, which is the influence of the luminaries, the astral bodies or heavenly bodies on the human body. The ens venenti, or veneni, which is the influence of toxins in the body, and that might include things that he considered medications. The ens naturale, the physical constitution of the person or their body itself. The ens spirituale, the influence of spirits. And the ens dei, the influence of God. So he investigated nature directly and discovered hidden correspondences between the cosmos and human beings. He also refuted Galen's conceptions of the nature of disease itself by focusing on the specificity of the disease as being variable rather than the individuality of the patient. And that fed into later theories of specific diseases in the 17th century. And I think that we can now see that it's important to take into account both the specificity of the disease and the individuality of the person when we're looking at an illness. So there was a parallel development of theories there that are really both quite important. His theory was that an internal alchemist, which he calls the archeus, functioned within the body, and that was responsible for maintaining proper balance and mixtures of different elements within the body. And that's the closest medical science had come to date to the concept of homeostasis that we use now in physiology. Based on this, he believed that cures were achieved by administering alchemically prepared remedies, which consisted of both minerals and plants. For example, he strongly advocated use of mercury to treat syphilis. Obviously, there's a delicate balance there between killing the organism without killing the patient, and certainly mercury was a much used remedy for many centuries and did quite a bit of harm as well as curing some. But that had been a problem in medicine for a long time, the toxicity of therapeutic agents such as bloodletting, which was often also quite damaging. But aside from this, he generally utilized mineral remedies much more than had previously been the practice in medicine. He had quite a distrust of traditional herbalism, which is interesting given the fact that he seemed to place a lot of stock in traditional healers or lay people in learning knowledge from them. But despite this, he revived an obscure first-century theory called the doctrine of signatures, which stated that the outward appearance of a plant, its color, its scent, its shape, or other features that you could observe about a plant, such as the environment that it grew in, would tend to give the physician information as to what it was useful for in the body. And this doctrine is still part of traditional herbalism today. Andreas Vesalius is our next luminary that we'll talk about in this part. He lived from 1514 to 1564, so not a super long life, 50 years. And he was considered the founder of modern anatomy. So I mentioned him back when I was talking about the establishment of the universities in Italy just before this time, and Vesalius writing the first treatise on human anatomy that was widely respected and corrected a lot of Galen's errors. So he was extensively engaged in human dissection, mostly on executed criminals, and he corrected errors that really had persisted since Galen, that had been adhered to very dogmatically by the medical establishment for all of that time. In 1543, he published his treatise on anatomy, and he was a lecturer at the Medical University at Padua in 1539. He was the first in a long line of anatomists that were associated with that particular university. The image here on the slide is the front cover illustration of De Humani Corporis Fabrica, which is translated as On the Fabric of the Human Body, which was written by Andreas Vesalius. And it shows a public dissection being carried out by Vesalius himself. He considered himself to be carrying on the tradition of Galen and other historical anatomists, and he showed them a lot of respect, whereas his consideration of the more supernatural or magical aspects of medicine in this time from the Asclepian cults was completely absent. So he was a real sort of focus on the physical. Despite his perspective on the theories of antiquity, he was really seen as upending Galenic anatomical findings, and for that he found much resistance actually in the medical establishment. He claimed to have discovered over 200 errors in Galen's prior work, and he established that there was serious error in Galen's theory about the movement of blood in the heart and the vessels, because Galen had posited that blood moved in a somewhat tidal sort of way, with the left side of the heart related to moving the blood to the brain and the right side relating to moving the blood to the lower body. And we now know, of course, that that is not true. So Vesalius didn't arrive at a correct theory himself about the movement of blood. That came later, but he did state his opinion that Galen's opinion was wrong. I'll just back up for a minute and tell you another thing about Paracelsus that I forgot from the prior slide, and that is the fact that Paracelsus was essentially driven out of the medical establishment over time because of how vocally opposed he was to Galen's theories. And he, at one time, threw a copy of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, which was based on Galenic medical theory, into a bonfire. And after that, he was pretty much exiled from the university medical establishment, and he didn't really teach much after that. He moved around quite a bit, and he never really was accepted back into the academic community. And maybe he wasn't too bothered by that, because he didn't seem to respect them very much. He was also had a very, very bombastic personality, very abrupt and relatively unlikable character, really. So that might have been part of the reason why he was ousted as well. So on to our next luminary, who is Louise Bourgeois. She lived from 1563 to 1636, and she was French, as her name probably implies. She was the reputed midwife who was selected to attend King Henry IV and Marie de Medici's 6 births, and she was the first midwife to write extensively on the practice of delivering babies. So much of her learning could have been from her husband, who was a barber surgeon, and he studied with Ambrose Paré, who I'll talk about a little bit more in the coming slides. So in normal labor, she really emphasized the importance of patience, sympathy, gentleness, and service to the mother. Her approach was very calm and non-interventional in nature, in order to allow for the process of birth to run its course unaided whenever possible. And she also documented very sound practice in dealing with problem deliveries as well. So she wasn't completely non-interventionist in nature as a midwife. And René Descartes. So we're going to talk a bit more about Descartes when we come to the area of psychology later on this semester, because he was perhaps more influential in that area. But it's worth noting him here now because he was a luminary of the Renaissance. He lived from 1596 to 1650, and he was also French, and he's considered the father of modern philosophy. So he developed and promoted mechanistic views of science and applied those views to plant, animal, and human bodies. So he was working in the more materialistic realm, and he developed a body of thought that covered physical and metaphysical areas, as well as epistemology, religion, and moral issues, and all together with science. He perhaps is most well known for his dictum, "I think, therefore I am," and he dealt a lot with the nature of the mind and the nature of thought as it related to science in particular. He had really major influences on medicine, but they were indirect, and that included sparking a view of the body like a machine governed by physical principles, universal laws of matter and motion, and a view of the mind and soul as separate from the body, being immaterial. So the body is this material, mechanistic thing, and the mind and the soul are separate and immaterial things. And aspects of the function of the body were considered by him to be under the control of the mind, which of course we know to be true now. This all seems pretty obvious looking at it in retrospect, but at the point in time of what they knew about human physiology, and particularly the nervous system, or the way that the brain works, or the spinal cord and the nerves work, it was a very, very different way of looking at the mind and the body at that time, and it really severely challenged humoral theory, because it basically said the body is a machine that works like a machine, and it really sort of denied all of the influences and the balancing conversation that was going on in humoral medicine for such a long period of time. Nicholas Culpeper is our next luminary, and he's one who is extremely important to current complementary medicine, in particular herbal medicine and naturopathy. So he was born in 1616 in England, died in 1654, again, not a very long life. He was a botanist and herbalist, as well as being an astrologer and a physician. And historically, he is probably one of the most influential herbalists that ever existed in the Western world. He popularized astrological herbalism, and he published texts called The English Physician and The Complete Herbal, which is now referred to as Culpeper's Herbal, or Culpeper's Complete Herbal sometimes. He was a Puritan, and so he was rejected by the mainstream medical establishment of the time, but his work was very popular in the Puritan community and was transmitted to America with the migration of that population to what's now called New England. And at one point, he was accused of witchcraft. Like Paracelsus, he subscribed to the doctrine of signatures, and he used it to investigate the medicinal properties of herbs. Also, very much like Paracelsus, he spent a great deal of time out in the field rather than in the classroom or with books. He was an avid naturalist, and he wished to reform medicine and make it more accessible to the lay person. And he's very much credited with sort of incorporating folk medicine and conventional medicine or scientific medicine together. Unlike Paracelsus, though, he did utilize Galen's humoral theory in his characteristic of cures. And so we have Paracelsus classifying herbs according to what effect they are having on the human body, and we have Culpeper who's classifying them based upon what effect they have on the humors, which was a method that was still in practice for, again, a fair bit of time after the time we're sitting at now. So his Complete Herbal systematized the use of herbal medicines and provided a vital step in the evolution of modern pharmacy as we know it today. Other major contributors, I mentioned Ambrose Paré a couple of slides ago. He lived from 1510 to 1590. He was the husband of Louise de Bourgeois, and he was a French surgeon and anatomist, very much known for his works in anatomy and surgery. William Harvey was an English anatomist who finally stated the correct theory in detail for how the heart, the arteries, and the veins are all involved in the circulation of blood. So this was the first description of how blood actually circulates through the system, including the respiratory or the pulmonary circulation. And Pierre Gassendi, a French philosopher whose successors in the 1670s stated the first theory of gas exchange in the lungs. So this is taking the theory further than it had been before. So a little bit more information about these guys. Paré was a military surgeon who, sorry, I misspoke a minute ago. He was the teacher of Louise de Bourgeois' husband, he wasn't her husband. So he developed major advances in battlefield medicine because the work in the battlefield was a great place to learn anatomy and surgery at that point in time. He included the adoption of 100-year-old Muslim methods for reducing wound infections to replace less effective methods that were commonly practiced at that time. He practiced ligature of arteries as more effective than cauterization during an amputation of a limb. And he invented new surgical instruments as well. He also advanced methods in high-risk childbirth that reduced infant mortality in non-normal presentations. So he could have passed that learning on to Louise Bourgeois' husband, who passed it on to her, and may have accounted for her success with non-normal deliveries. He also contributed to advances in prosthetic limbs and also artificial eyes. William Harvey studied under Vesalius's successors at the University of Padua, and he published on the circulatory system of blood in 1628. So that was the year that we finally knew how it was that, that blood circulated around the body. And Vesalius and Harvey were both opposed and ostracized for not holding to Galen's authority and views, despite the fact that Galen was wrong. Harvey's other major contribution was demonstrating the usefulness of experimental research to resolve physiological questions. So we have physiological research starting to sort of show its face in scientific medical exploration at this point in time. A couple of other major contributors during the Renaissance period, Jean-Baptiste von Helmont was a Flemish chemist who studied chemical fermentation, and he made early explanations of the physiological nature of digestion. And this was obviously an important early understanding to thinking about things like nutrition and why we get different things from different foods and how that is assimilated into the body. And then Thomas Sydenham was a prominent English physician who believed that diseases could be classified similarly to how Linnaeus would later group plants. And we'll talk about Linnaeus in our next session when we take up part 2 of European medicine. So Thomas Sydenham was urging practitioners really to ignore the conflicting views of the time, the really dogmatic humoral practice versus the new scientific views, in favor of establishing really complete clinical descriptions of diseases. And he was very interested in the classification of disease, and then developing specific remedies for each disease classification. So you see with Thomas Sydenham the shift away from theoretical medicine that is focusing on anatomy, physiology, chemistry, and really focusing more into clinical medicine at that point in time. And that was sort of the bridge that was needed in order to bring the new developments in science into practice so that they were actually useful in the practice of medicine. As an example, from modern times, he might have been aligned with our classification, say, of bacterial infections as a group, and then the use of antibiotics as a specific remedy for that class of groups. Now, he was way before that time, but that's just an example that we might be able to relate to in our time. So the seat at the bedside, which he adopted, was a very Hippocratic method of exploration of disease, and he used this method to give detailed descriptions of smallpox, dysentery, gout, and measles. It's said that Hippocrates wrote the histories of sick patients, but Sydenham wrote the histories of diseases. He also expanded on Paracelsus's use of opium, which was relatively extensive, and created his own version of laudanum, which is a derivative of opium, that compounded opium with sherry and other different herbs that were mixed in with that to make it have a better effect in terms of pain relief. So that brings us to the end of session 14 and the end of part 4. Your revision questions are there as well as on the LMS. And your other food for thought: why do you think there was difficulty translating the new scientific ideas into practical new diagnosis and treatment practices during this period? That was really their main obstacle, as they stuck with the old practices. So thank you for joining, and I will see you in session 15. Bye.